Mr. Chomsky, thank you for sparing your precious time to speak in with us. On behalf of Media TV, thank you again, sir. My first question would be, after the invasion of Iraq, many balances were turned upside down as a result of the war, and new balances emerged. Kurdish forces, which were once the factor in the region, are now actors. Today, a concrete example of this came to life in Rojava, North and East Syria. And the Kurds are struggling to establish a social life based on diversity and differences in order to ensure peace in the region. However, Turkey constantly attacks the region and thousands of people has been displaced and hundreds have been killed as a result of these attacks. In one side, USA supports Kurds in Syria. However, the same USA supports Turkey's war policies in the region. What I mean is USA have military ties with northeast Syria. However, politically, they work with Turkey. Can this change with the Biden government? How do you define these complex relations in this context and the future of the region, of course?
Well, the invasion of Iraq had complex effects. Of course, it was devastating for Iraq, hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions of refugees. It incited ethnic conflicts which had not existed before, which have torn the country apart and spread and have been tearing the region apart. There are many other factors. The brutal reaction of the Assad regime to the early demonstrations led to murderous, brutal civil war, which has devastated Syria. It's spread to other countries. Lebanon is practically disappearing at this point. There's never been such a crisis in Lebanon or other countries. So the Biden administration so far has pretty much continued Trump's policies with little changes. One of the policies, crucially, was to destroy the joint agreement, the JCPOA, the joint agreement on Iranian nuclear programs. Trump withdrew from it, essentially destroyed it over the strong objections of Europe in violation of Security Council orders. Biden has, and he also imposed extremely harsh sanctions. The Biden administration, for the time being, has pretty much continued those policies, except rhetorically. It says it's willing to go back to some version of the joint agreement, but not the one that was originally agreed to and that the US violated. So the region's in turmoil. There are some positive signs. There are slight moves towards mutual accommodation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, United Arab Emirates and Iran, that might lessen tensions in the region. It might lead to more regional efforts to deal with their own problems, maybe extricating themselves from a certain extent from US intervention, other foreign intervention. It's conceivable, but at the moment it looks quite grim.
Thank you, sir. My next question would be on by officially and instantly denying the nation state and by trying to create an administrative structures that incorporate these different elements. The Rojava model gives to minorities a participatory role unprecedented in the Middle East. The Rojava model is based on two main pillars, which may prove very efficient in the strengthening of democracy in the region. By officially and instantly denying the nation state and by administrative structures that incorporate these different elements. So the Rojava model gives to minorities a participatory role unprecedented in the Middle East. The Roja administration, of course, defends and implements Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan's views, who urged that people can coexist without the need of a state and to establish a multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. So what do you think are the steps that need to be taken for the existence of this system to be accepted in the international arena?
The nation-state system was pretty much a 19th century creation. Nation-states were imposed in Europe, in the colonized areas, mostly with considerable violence. And without much concern or interest in the needs and desires of the people, particularly in the colonized areas. The state system was simply imposed. So, for example, in Iraq, the British cobbled together Shiite, Sunni, Kurds, drew the boundaries where it wanted for British imperial purposes. The northern areas that have oil resources which are claimed by Turkey, were incorporated in Iraq so that Britain could have control of them. Principality of Kuwait was carved out so as to, and put under British control, so as to restrict Iraqi access to the sea through the Gulf. The same things were happening in other countries all around the world. The net effect is a system of states which are fragile, competing. Many groups simply have no state structure. Kurds, Palestinians. It's the question. If the question of how one can move out of this system is by no means easy. The state system which was established is very hard to change. There can be moves towards relieving the sharpness of boundaries and the conflicts that come along with them. European Union is an illustration of this. For centuries, Europe was the most savage, brutal place in the world. Slaughtering one another was the main occupation of Europeans for centuries. Finally, in 1945, it became clear to everyone that the next time they play their favorite game of mutual slaughter, it'll be total devastation, nothing else. We've reached a point where major wars are simply impossible. So Europe began to move towards some kind of slow integration. Began with economic arrangements, later some political arrangements. European Union is a complex and fragile structure, many problems, but in fact it's a major improvement over warring states. At least France and Germany aren't engaged in slaughtering one another. The ability to travel from one part of the Union to another without going through checkpoints, barriers, passports, and so on, that's a step forward. Many problems, but it's the kind of move that can take place. In the Middle East, it would be very reasonable. Nobody wants to return to the Ottoman Empire with its brutality and corruption. But there were some things about the Ottoman Empire which were positive. You could travel from Cairo to Baghdad to Constantinople, Istanbul, without passing through border checks. It was just one integrated area. People were mostly left alone to run their own affairs. The Greek community in Damascus, Beirut, could run their own affairs. Well, not beautiful in many ways, but some value to it. I might add just a personal anecdote to illustrate it. Back 70 years ago, 1953, I happened to be working for a while in a kibbutz in northern Israel, and I was hiking in the northern Galilee, the way young people do, backpack and so on. It was an evening, a road, and there was a road behind me. A Jeep pulled up. Man got out of the Jeep and started calling me, telling me to come back. I said, "What's the problem?" They said, "You're in the wrong country." I had crossed into the border to Lebanon, which at that point was unmarked. And of course, the border is totally artificial. It was just imposed by French-British imperialism. It has nothing to do with the people of the region. So by now, of course, the border is an armed camp. At that point, it was open. Well, that's the way the region in many ways used to be. And an effort to move back in that direction, while extremely difficult, could be highly beneficial to the people of the region. It would more closely reflect the actual demographic and cultural realities, just as in Europe. But it's going to take an enormous effort to do that. And we're very far from achieving that. Take a look at the United States. The phrase United States was plural until 1860. It was the United States, or not is, because they were a group of United States. Then came a civil war. By that time, one of the most awful wars in history, huge devastation. The United States became singular. It's now the United States is, in many languages, it's still called plural. Estados Unidos in Spanish is plural. Well, that was a tremendous struggle to turn the United States from a confederation of pretty much separate states into a single unitary state with plenty of problems. There are talks of secession, for example. These are not easy problems to handle, even after hundreds of years.
Thank you. As you are well aware that the PKK fought against ISIS terror, which has been a threat to the whole world, and PKK lost hundreds of its fighters in this fight against ISIS evil and rescued thousands of people in the region. However, PKK is still seen as a terrorist organization by NATO members. And we all know that this policy is not helping the solution of Kurdish question and the peace in the region. And most importantly, Turkey is using this as an excuse to its ethnic cleansing policy. What are your comments on this, sir?
Well, the Kurds have had a brutal and miserable history. The worst, I mean, it's pretty bad everywhere, but the worst has actually been in Turkey. Goes far back. In the 1990s, there was enormous Turkish state terrorism, which was caused horrifying circumstances in southeastern Turkey. Tens of thousands of Kurds were killed. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, were driven out of their homes, driven often into the slums of Istanbul. I've actually visited some of these slums in decaying, destroyed areas of Istanbul, which are almost unlivable. Families confined to a single room. People can't go out. in the early 2000s, there was some relaxation, improvement. You could sense, I traveled there a couple of times, you could sense the differences. There were some hope by the late, after the European Union made it clear that they were not going to accept Turkey as a member, and the Erdogan regime took over, became much harsher. By now, it's not back to the 1990s, but there are very serious, brutal attacks against Kurds in the Kurdish areas. In Syria, the Rojava area did manage to sustain itself in the midst of a hideous civil war. Trump administration pulled out the small U.S. detachment, which was deterring a further Syrian Turkish attack. Now the Kurdish areas are caught between two enemies, basically. Turkey on the one hand, the Assad regime on another. So far, sustaining itself, but it's a very perilous situation. Iran, again, lots of oppression of Kurds. The northern Iraq region, the Kurdish area has degree of autonomy, but unfortunately is being riven by internal conflicts. Lots of corruption, lots of brutality, has not been able to establish itself. So it's a very painful, difficult situation. By rights, the Kurds, maybe 25 million or so, should have a form of integration and autonomy, but that will not happen until the whole region moves towards a more sensible form of integration, maybe something along the lines of the European Union. Notice that the European Union, with all of its flaws, is a big improvement, and it took centuries of murderous violence to achieve it. You go back to the 17th century, 30 Years' War, probably 40% of the population of Germany was exterminated. These were not small conflicts. I don't have to talk about the 20th century, which was just a horror story. At least that's relieved, and maybe that's an indication that humans can somehow move towards more reasonable, sane forms of mutual integration based on a degree of mutual support and amity instead of hatred and brutality. But human history is not very attractive when we look at these problems.
Noam Chomsky, one of the most influential public intellectual in the world. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us today, answering our questions. If you would like to finish by, if you have any message to the Kurdish people, thank you very much, sir.
Keep your courage up. There have been achievements. There's promise for the future, despite the brutality and horrors of the present. It's happened before, can happen again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.